Are the slides working? Can we get a confirmation on that? We get a 1 second. All right, so I'll just do my intro in the meantime. So my name is Parag Vaish. I am with Google. I'm in a group called Area 120. Area 120, part of Google, is an incubation team that basically incubates new divisions of Google to be aspiring to be something the size of Gmail, YouTube, Android, etc. So we're taking something from the kernel of nothing and trying to figure out how it can be something enormous one day. So Vivek asked me to speak to you today about my experiences, and they're pretty wide-reaching. So I'll give you a little bit of a glimpse of me in general. So I mentioned my Google experience, but behind Google was a lot of different experiences. So I've worked at companies like Tesla, Disney, NBC News, Microsoft, division of eBay, that's StubHub, and a couple of healthcare companies along the way. I'm starting to see what Rob meant about this clicker. There's definitely a delay. So I think the point of this discussion is to hear about how I did my trade, which is product management, and how I went about the process of prioritizing decisions. If you have 100 things you can build, how do you choose one, number 7, number 92 on the list, to decide which of those to go forward with? And so the experiences from these companies are what form my opinion across decision making. So I'll go through a couple of case studies, a couple of examples from different companies, and show you some fun stories along the way. So let's see about this clicker. So like I said, aligning the vision to a prioritization act. So I worked for Elon at Tesla. And so he's a very difficult person to work for. And so you take a vision, and how do you enable that across a 400-person team and make it a reality? So when Rob asks for a camping feature in a product, how do you turn that into reality? So that's what I want to talk to you about today. Now, there's different ways that companies go about figuring out how to do prioritization, how to enable a team to be successful. So there's different models out there. Is anyone familiar with the GROW model? Okay, I see Rit. Can I get a different clicker or something to advance this forward? Differently, it's just not... Okay, so let's start with the SMART goal-setting model. So anyone familiar with the SMART model? A couple of hands. So specific, measurable, achievable, realistic, timely. Yeah, okay, cool. All right, and so then there's another model, if we can get the screen to progress forward. Okay, the OKR model, thank you. The OKR model, so this is used by Google quite often. So objectives and key results. So it's a very cascading model, so I kind of like this. And then there's another model, which is the GROW model, as we said. So goals, reality, options, will. Anyone familiar with this one? I wasn't. All right. So there are a few other models that are out there. So Crystal, let's go to the next one. So this is Steve Ballmer, roughly circa 2000 or so, if you can go back just to hold there. So roughly 2000 or so. So as I say, enthusiasm, that's all he had at that time. He was just screaming to this crowd. It was worse than it looks, by the way. It was much worse than it looks. So he was just screaming at the audience developers, and that's not implementing a strategy. That's not logical in my mind for how you turn it into reality and make it actionable. But you have other folks like Steve Jobs, who was incredible about taking a vision and making it a reality because he was very hands-on. He's actually very much like Elon, very hands-on on decision-making and implementing, making sure it works. There are other folks out there. So Ron Johnson, anyone familiar with Ron Johnson from JCPenney? So he spent time at Apple and Target beforehand. So Ron Johnson abandoned all conventional wisdom of what was previously known at this company and basically said, we're going to do it a different way. We're going to do the way the Apple and Target did things. And he abandoned all of his management staff, got rid of those catalogs. If anybody remembers those catalogs used to arrive in the mail, all that stuff went away. So this is one of those sad stories of the valuation of the company dropped by billions of dollars. There were layoffs, and he was out after, 18, 24 months or so. So this model that's on the screen, Crystal, if you can expand one more, this model is the objectives, goals, strategies, measures model. Anyone familiar with this model? Okay, I see a couple of hands. So this is the model that I tend to use for how do you take a strategy from the highest point, Elon saying, go do this, to eventually get to the camping mode, right, which is a feature or a particular project. So if we can go, Crystal, one more slide. I'm going to do a case study here with you all. Okay, so this is a company I've not worked for, Netflix, right? Anyone here work for Netflix? Okay, so I think we're all familiar with Netflix. So let's go through a case study. So before we advance the slide, go back one. Go back one. I guess I don't need this anymore. I'll just raise my hand, Crystal. So what do you all think would be the main objective of Netflix if you're to figure out, like, what's their main strategy or objective right now? Anyone? Grow subscribers. Okay, so now let's go through it. We're going to go through a case study here. So if you had your objective, imagine you're running, Netflix or some senior person there, and you say profitably and sustainably increase the Netflix subscriber base. How do you do that? How do you turn it into a sequential model that everyone in the company can embrace this? So I'll ask you, Crystal, to expand one. So one way to do that is to increase your conversion rate from 3% to 8%. Right? That's the number of people who are basically converting, who are transacting or signing up for the Netflix service. Then, as you see, you have strategies. So you have a goal, now you have strategies. That's ways in which you can influence the ability to impact conversion. So conversion rate through friction reduction. Maybe it's higher communication. Maybe it's better understanding of the different content formats, what you get for each different tier of price level. Right? And then you have the last one, which is the measures. So how do you mathematically calculate to say whether or not the strategies are working, because you have the math behind it to say, here's what you're actually trying to achieve numerically, right? So this is the model that I believe in, is being able to go from beginning to end. Thank you very much. Being able to go from beginning to end. Now, imagine if you had additional goals. This is essentially, you're crafting your plan, your total plan to say, how do I increase the subscriber base? So you might have things like reduce the number of customer service calls. That increases your profitability as a result. Or you might have something like increase your NPS score, right? The number of people who are satisfied versus unsatisfied by your business. You're going to hear from Richard later. I think he's going to father of NPS, right, Vivek? So this is the way I think about goal setting in my world. Everything I do should fit on one page. If it doesn't, I'm kind of doing it wrong. It's too complicated. So at Tesla, we implemented a model just like this across each of my different teams. Whether it was the in-car display team, whether it was the mobile app team, the buying experience on the web, you name it. Each one had a one-page summary going from the top-level goal through to each of the subsequent initiatives along the way. But as you see here, it says Q4 projects. So how do you pick the projects that you work on? Right? So at Tesla, it's mostly Elon that decides it. So here he hears from Rob, and then gets put them on our roadmap. But other companies, you actually have latitude, and you want to engage people. So I was listening to Rob describe his product and how you engage employees, and how an engaged employee is someone who's more focused, more dedicated, tends to stay longer because they're involved in the process, right? So the second thing I want to talk to you about is how do you go about selecting the right projects to work on? So we're going to go through a different case study here. So I'll put you in my shoes. I was the head of product for StubHub. You all know StubHub? Okay. So when I first joined, there were 100 ideas that were on the list to be able to possibly implement it into a StubHub mobile app. But we had capacity to do 5 or 7 any given quarter. So how do you choose amongst those 100? What's the best way? What are some ideas that you have for how do you choose which idea to go after? Anyone? Highest return. Okay. So how do you know the highest return? On 100 projects, 1 to 100, what's the highest return? A/B testing, maybe? Revenue projections, et cetera. Okay. So I didn't have the luxury of any time to figure out, the 100. What was the number? So I didn't know what was going to be, the most revenue generating because I didn't have the time to do an A/B test. I meant I have to build it to be able to figure out if I was going to get the revenue for it. So I'd have to build 100 things to then A/B test. It's very hard to do that. So I took 100 ideas, and I had my product managers describe each of those 100 ideas in the form of a 140-character description, just a simple nod to Twitter at the time. Something as simple as that. No complex business case, No 72-page slide deck from McKinsey, none of that stuff, just 140 characters. What is this project? Camping mode, for example, the ability to keep the airflow going for 48 hours in a sustained fashion, so Rob can sleep in the car. Right? Then I had my engineering team assess the level of effort and a simple t-shirt size, small, medium, large. That's it. Right? You can add extra small or extra large if you wanted to, but just small, medium, large is fine for me. And then I looked at the vectors for value. All right, so Richard Court. The vectors of value. To your point about what is the value, what is the revenue. So I looked at these drivers of, and my belief is that every CEO's target goal is to increase shareholder value. That's a very hard thing to influence when you're at an individual contributor level or a team level. So then you work one step down. What are the drivers of shareholder value? Revenue growth, margin growth, or market share growth, in my opinion. So then I looked at the drivers of those three things. What drives revenue, market share, or margin? Right? It's these five at StubHub. So if you think about it, put yourself in the shoes of a CEO of StubHub. If you increase conversion, that means the number of people who are buying tickets increases. That's transactional revenue. If you increase your traffic, that means someone has shared the fact that they're going to the Post Malone concert with someone else. That brings in someone else into the experience for free traffic. Now you've acquired somebody at no cost. Net Promoter Score, more satisfaction. If you have a reduction in cost in your business, that improves your margin. Or if you increase your ticket inventory, there's more stuff for people to buy. You may not know this, but 1 in 4 people who buy a ticket from StubHub end up calling customer service. Think about that. That's a $7 to $10 phone call if you're operating it in even in inexpensive markets. Right? So if somebody buys a $20 baseball ticket and calls customer service, all the margins eroded. Right? So bringing down cost matters quite a bit. So if you have this structure in place, then because I was brand new to StubHub, what I did is I engaged the team, the people on my team, the people who had been there for years. And I said, let's take those 100 projects. Let's just look at 22 on this screen for now. And look at what do you think, each of you as the people on the team, think about the value vectors that are listed at the top and the small, medium, large that are driving their value. So you take one line item here and you say, well, let's look at gift card redemption, for example. And someone goes through and says, to what extent does this drive conversion? Small, medium, large. What does it drive? Traffic, small, medium, large. And you're just getting a general guidepost, their gut feel as to where it's going to go. And you take this across a wide spectrum of people, you start to get a mathematical score behind the scenes. If you put a number behind small, medium, large, you get maybe a 139 is what I used. Now you can use a math equation to rank 1 to 100. What is the value of each of those projects? So now I have 4.2, 4.4, 4.5 on this list. I know that those are bubbling up to the top for me to evaluate against the 100 projects more effectively. It's not linear to say that 4.4 is definitely worse than 4.5. You're just kind of looking at top half, bottom half type stuff here, right? But I found something else really interesting. When I looked at this list, I could see exactly how each person scored each project. So if you see the names listed here, myself, Marcus, Anand, Nikhil, dev manager, this is how they scored each project. Think about this for a moment. I can now see how people think. How powerful is that to know exactly what the people on your team are thinking? Now put yourself in your shoes back at your office. You have many different personalities on your team. There's someone who's outspoken. There's someone who's soft-spoken. There's someone who just joined the company 2 months ago. Someone who's been there for 8 years. All these different personalities are influencing a room in the absence of a process like this. But in the presence of a process like this, you have a level playing field. So you have a 140-character description of every project. You have people looking at it saying, what is the value of each project, small, medium, large? And you get to see how they think. And it's very fascinating. You see things like the soft-spoken person in the room favors certain types of projects. Or the people who've been there for 8 years have very low faith that anything's going to work. Their scores are always low, right? You start to see deltas. So if you look at certain places, the first one that I've circled in red there, that person, Anand, is not exactly on the same page with the other folks that have rated those two projects. If you look at his scores, 2.6 and 0.9, relative to the other people on the list, his is definitively the lowest. So what does Anand know about these projects that I don't? Or vice versa? Now you can use data to extract from Anand specifically what does he believe or not believe about this project. And it's possible he misunderstood the project, or he has better data than the rest of us. But you can now use data to get that out from the people and have a more fruitful conversation with your team. Right? You keep going, and you start to see these patterns. So I added the engineering assessment. So what you see here is engineering, UX, and QA size. Okay, so this is level of effort associated with building each of these features. So Richard, like you were asking about, what's the revenue, what's the return on investment? Now you can get to an ROI score. If you know what the value projection is versus the expense projection, you can compare those two and say something that might have a value vector. Let's look at the two examples here. Something has a value vector of 1.8. This one right here, the business score is 4.5. The business score is 4.5 versus a 4.2. So the 4.5 is definitely better than the 4.2, right? But if you look at the level of effort behind the native checkout experience, this is a medium in engineering versus a small. So on the far right here, this shows you that the ROI score is materially different for the project that's 4.2 because you can get it out to market faster. So if you start looking at rate of production of your feature set in terms of its value, now you can look at it from an ROI perspective. This is enlightening, right? So what did this lead to? Number one, a 3x increase in the business metrics. This became a $1 billion line of business because of this model, right? Roughly $300 million before that, right? The increase in employee retention, so the point about engagement. So we went from 14 months as an average to 25 months. And that was Bay Area, so it's a little bit different in the Bay Area. 25 months is gold mine if you can keep somebody for 2 years, right? And then they're still using it today. StubHub is still using it, and I left that company 5 years ago. So it's not even about me and the person who's in the spot who created the model and imposed it upon everyone. It's still in place today, and I left many years ago. Right? So my point is it's about the team. And so if you take the projects that you just now figured out based on that methodology and you input it against this list, now you can say, here are my projects. So in Tesla land, we're going to do a camping mode. That would be one line item, against this list. But you've gone from what's your strategy at the top level, from directives like the CEO and others, through to what do you measure along the way, and then what are you going to actually build? And what I've found is that developers, UX folks, product managers, this is complete transparency. What are we building? Why are we building it? What are we hoping to influence? And how does it help the company? Everyone's on the same page then. You create alignment against the CEO's vision. So to me, it's all about the team and not the hippo, right? But you got to keep in mind, there's times when you can have the best laid plans, but you need to have flexibility. So does anyone remember the release of the Tesla Roadster, the announcement? It's November 16th, 2017. Okay, so we launched a Tesla Roadster that day, right? And so for the 6 weeks or 8 weeks prior, we were building the website such that you can transact and put a deposit down on this beautiful, gorgeous vehicle, right? Night before, 11:32, I get a call from Elon. He says he wants to release 2 versions of the vehicle. We had not built anything to accommodate for 2 because there was only one thing that was being released. So 11:32, so less than 24 hours, we need to rebuild everything about this experience, right? So you can have the best laid plans. You can have all kinds of spreadsheets that calculate value and metrics. You can do all that fun stuff, put a slide together, but then you get a couple of these folks in the room, who say, we're just going to change it. Let's change it all. But then when you see what happens, So you get the pleasure of experiencing something that's unplanned, and it's glorious, right? And so the Roadster was a secret release that night. We were actually launching the semi-truck. And so the Roadster comes out of this semi-truck with the smoke and the music, and what you heard in the background was cheering. That was everyone in the crowd going nuts at the fact that the Roadster was being released that day. So you might think that this is like pretty amazing and pretty awesome. Well, when I was at Tesla, we had a sister company called SpaceX who outdid us 3 months later. So let me know if you remember this. So that brings a tear to my eye still, honestly, seeing those two rockets land back on Earth. How amazing of a moment was that? So when Dan was giving his intro about me and all the things that I work on, water conservation and hip-hop music and stuff, this is now my bar. You know, now it's about a rocket launch with a vehicle in it, you know, out to space. And all of the stuff that I've done has led up to this place where it's like, we've got to go change the world in some fashion. And so I wanted to convey to you this story of how it goes from tactical action at the very, you know, basic level through to making a difference in the world. Thank you very much for your time. I hope you enjoyed this. I'm happy to answer questions here or later based on whatever time horizon we have. Anyone have any questions you want to ask? Yeah, Richard.
So you went when Anon
Yeah.
Was negative on things. He was negative on everything.
Yeah.
Was there something about, where you looked at him and said, you're kind of like a thorn in everybody's side?
I mean, he is, but that's not the point. He had been at the company for 6 or 7 years, and he had seen not many things work. So he had just general skepticism. And in this case, there was a little bit too much rigidity with small, medium, large. And so for him, it was very hard to figure out, like, picture what a large meant. It had to be something revolutionary. And so everything got scored in the small, medium category rather than a relative basis. So we actually made an adjustment to it, which was, if StubHub was going to buy some other company, if he thought that was a large, we need to recalibrate his orientation towards this is a project we can control in our own hands now would be considered a large. Buying a company is outside the scope of this project. Similarly, like bugs that you have in the product, that's also outside the scope of this. So once you start to calibrate and say a small, medium, and a large mean these type of things got more on track. Anyone else? Yeah.
So I run a marketing consulting company, and we work for a lot of big clients. And going back to your example from StubHub, what we find with companies is it's not hard for a big company to come up with a list of 100 things because they have lots of employees and they do brainstorming sessions. What we find is you get 100, but it doesn't include the correct 100. And there's actually 20 that are just not even on their radar because they're working from within the company, they're looking at the competition. How have you reconciled that? Because we spend a lot of time with our clients figuring out the 100's great, but here's what you really, really need to be working on, things that don't currently exist. And I assume you must
Yeah.
come up with that a lot.
Yeah, in the first part of your question, I was thinking the answer to your question actually resides in Ideascale, with Rob's product, which is, taking the 100 and be able to get, votes up and down, bubble things up and the top ones will rise, through the product they built, which then you can craft that against the, the model that I've shown here, which Rob has implemented called Review Scale. It's within the product of Ideascale. So you can do everything I've just shown you from spreadsheet, directly within Review Scale. Now, if your question is about your 100 is off track, or your 100 is missing, 20 things that they ought to go do, that's currently
100
yeah.
is still an incomplete list.
Yeah, that's right. 100's incomplete. So, to me, it sounds like, either innovation day kind of a thing, get people out of the office and go figure out how to get them, those new ideas, or maybe folks like yourself who can offer the consulting service. They say, let's think differently and open up this new category. Then you get to the 120, and then maybe you consider some process that's similar to this.
So, we charge a lot of money for that.
Perfect.
I was just wondering,
Yeah.
because of the industries that you work for,
Right.
the companies, if you've come across that and how you kind of work.
Yeah, I don't think I have a silver bullet answer. I think it's engaging companies like yourselves to help us think differently. So I've engaged design firms in particular, and especially ones who've worked with companies like Slack and others, like really innovative companies who said, there's got to be a better way than email, or there's got to be a better way than, the standard messaging capabilities that are out there. And so those are the people who figured out what doesn't exist ever before. And that's who I engage to be able to bring it along. So maybe it's a validation for your company and the service you offer. Rit? Let's go to a customer. John, Joe.
So when you choose an idea and that idea gets going, but then all of a sudden you realize it's maybe not going to be working, what's your experience or your thoughts on when you pull the plug on that project, and how far you're into it, and those parts of when you really should take a step back and be like, all right, this isn't going to work.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think of Jeff Bezos' advice. He has something called tier 1 decisions and tier 2 decisions. I don't remember which one's which, but it's basically like you can't undo the decision versus you can quickly undo it. So basically the idea there is if you're dealing with a decision that you cannot undo, you've got to be more certain about that decision, right? Versus the opposite. If you can undo it and it's inexpensive to make that mistake, it may be worth it to go forward with it. The other way, and this is also an Amazon Jeff Bezos thing, is they write press releases for the project that they're embarking upon before they write any code or do anything else. And so usually in most companies, the press release is the last thing you do minutes before the release, by the PR person. At Amazon, it's the first thing that they do. And so so I've implemented that, Joe, in my businesses. And I found that it de-risks whether or not it's worth building the project, that initiative, because you now know what's the story you're going to tell the world, So hopefully that gives you a little bit of, coaching. Millennial?
No, I was just curious. So, when you're taking the engineering teams, like a small, medium, large model, what sort of weight do designers have in that process? Like, what is a UX designer's input to kind of estimate how feasible the project is?
Yeah, it's a good question, Rit. So the engineering expense is probably the most expensive amongst that array. The reason I put UX and QA levels of effort on that list is because I want to know staffing levels. So if you end up picking 5 projects, and they might be 2 smalls, 2 mediums, and 1 large on the engineering track, but if they're all large on UX, you might have a UX problem from a staffing perspective. So if you get their way in on the UX level of effort, you can then visually see where you need additional assistance from a talent perspective. And then you start thinking about what's my burst capacity for UX people, et cetera, et cetera. But I don't ever have a UX person evaluate the engineering effort, nor the engineering person evaluate the UX effort, and so on. Just kind of relegate them to their classification. They can all value the projects. And I found actually that means that they're more invested in the success of the project because they had input into it in the first place. Crystal, one more? Go ahead.
I was just going to say that all of my customers and employees they're my only customers. But what I find is that 25,000 of them are students 2,000 of them are faculty, and the 2,000 staff are making the decisions, or answering all those questions for what these people want. And then they wonder why they can't get them to use the products or get buy-in from them, you know, so once in a while they'll do a survey, but I still don't think the surveys are to get those answers, you know, to get that list. It's to find out how we're already doing, or
After the
you know,
fact.
trying to lead the question, lead them into giving the answer they want, as opposed to trying to get true answers that would really be valuable.
Yeah, I think if you look at it in step notch here, so I do think the Ideascale product is great for the idea collection and evaluation. So just in your example of 25,000 students, if they were able to or incented to participate in the ideation of what it is that people would want to do, and then, you know, bubble the top ones up, maybe it is the final 2,000 staff members who need to evaluate which ones you can execute upon. Right.
I agree with that.
Yeah, and so you have that sequence where it's like the top of funnel is your 25,000 or the 27,000 with the faculty as well, saying what is the inbound, what is the stuff we want to consider. And then based on that, you figure out what's executable based on the second model we have. I think we're out of time, Crystal, right? Yeah. Okay, I'll come see you afterwards. Okay, thank you all. Nice to meet you.